So what I'm going to talk about some ideas that very much complement what you've already heard, and I'm going to have to mention another book, one that I happen to have written, published a year ago, entitled Managing Without Growth, and talk about some of the ideas in this book, which, as I say, in many ways complement a lot of what Tim has had to say. I look at this in the following way. I think there are three major strands of argument which suggest why rich countries should seriously consider managing without growth, because if we don't, we may very well find ourselves having to do it anyway. The first of which is that I believe, for reasons you've already heard the others talk about, growth is not possible in the long term because of some very serious environmental constraints. And the second strand of the argument is that plenty of evidence to show that in rich countries, by and large, growth does not make anybody any happier after a certain level of income has been achieved. And the third is that if you look at the record of growth in a rich country like Canada, where I live, over the last 30 years or so, and before the current recession, the record of growth has been rather disappointing. It hasn't brought us full employment. It hasn't eradicated, even reduced poverty. A number of important environmental problems have got worse, and so you kind of wonder, well, if growth hasn't solved the problems, then maybe finding ways to manage without growth may be where we should be looking. Well, part of my approach to this has been to build a macroeconomic model of the Canadian economy as an example of rich economies, and as with all computer models, you leave out a great deal, and I'm the first to admit that. But I use this model in particular to answer, or try to answer, a specific question. And this is the question: can we have full employment, low poverty, fiscal balance, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions without relying on economic growth? If it turns out that we can't, using even standard economics, come up with an answer to that which is anything like yes, then we really have a major, major problem on our hands. But fortunately, I think there are answers that suggest that we can, in fact, have all of this without relying on economic growth. So what I'm going to do now is give you a little bit of an insight into the way I approach modeling this the Canadian economy and the kind of answers that I came up with. The first thing is to just retrace our steps a little bit and think about what makes an economy grow. Well, we can look at this in two ways. The first is to look at what we spend money on, macroeconomic demand, which consists of what we spend in the stores, consumption, what we spend on all kinds of investment, new equipment and infrastructure. It includes what government spends on goods and services. And if we run a trade balance that's positive, then that will add to macro demand and will show up as a positive contribution to GDP. We can also look at the growth question in terms of what we produce. And in the simplest possible terms, what we produce depends upon the labor force and the kind of skills and how much of the labor force is actually employed, the stock of capital that the labor force has to work with, and then all of the things that contribute to productivity. So having this kind of perspective on economic growth, we can then say, well, what would happen if the trends in each of those variables that we witnessed in the past 30 years or so were to continue over the next 30 years? And we can call that a business as usual scenario. You'll notice that this scenario runs from 2005 to 2035, so it really begins before the current recession and really doesn't show that as an activity or as an aspect of the business as usual scenario. We're looking at long-term trends of a growing economy of the kind we've seen for 30 years. And here you can see what this business as usual scenario looks like. GDP per capita, the black line, shows a steady increase so that in 30 years we'd be roughly twice as rich as we are at the start of this period. Greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, not as fast as GDP per capita, because we're getting some decline in relative intensity. Unemployment goes up, comes down again, doesn't do very much, but does approach full employment. The really bad news is this brown line, which is the UN's poverty index, consisting of an income measure, adult illiteracy, and a health measure. And this would show that there would be more poor Canadians at the end of the period than at the beginning under business as usual. And the government's debt to GDP ratio looks pretty healthy and continues to decline. So the next step in the analysis is to say, well, what would happen if we eliminated all of the sources of growth starting in the year 2010 and phasing them down so that by the year 2020, none of these contributors for growth were in fact growing anymore. And you might expect that it would be a disaster, and you would be quite right. This is how it appears from the model. Unemployment goes right off the graph, poverty goes up, poverty index goes up very high, the government's debt to GDP ratio gets completely unmanageable. GDP per capita finally settles down at a constant level towards the end of the period, and greenhouse gas emissions come down a little bit. But this is a very frightening scenario, and one that I'm certainly not promoting, and we have to wonder whether we can find a better perspective, a better set of opportunities for us than this kind of chaotic result.